Ethan Caldwell had a way of arriving everywhere too late and too quietly for anyone to notice, or so he believed. At 33, he had mastered the art of invisibility inside his own life. His penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood sat 62 floors above the city, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the skyline back at itself like a proud mirror. From up there, everything looked small and manageable. The traffic, the people, the ordinary human dramas playing out on the streets below. Ethan had learned early that distance was the safest place to live. He had inherited his father's real estate empire at 25, when a sudden heart attack had taken Harrison Caldwell at 61, a man who had spent so many hours building his fortune that he had forgotten to build anything else. Ethan had watched his father die surrounded by lawyers and board members and very few people who actually loved him. He had promised himself he would be different. He had not kept that promise. Instead, he had simply become a younger, more efficient version of his father, brilliant at acquiring things, terrible at keeping people. By 33, Ethan's net worth had eclipsed $2 billion. He had properties in 7 countries, a yacht he had sailed exactly once, a cellar of wine he was too busy to drink, and a collection of cars he mostly drove to the office and back. He had a personal chef who made meals he ate standing over the kitchen counter, too distracted by his phone to sit down. He had a personal trainer he canceled on regularly. He had a string of relationships that had each ended the same way, not in arguments or dramatic scenes, but in a quiet drift, like boats that had simply stopped being tied to the same dock. What he also had since 4 months ago was Maria Santos. She had come through an agency with references so glowing they had almost seemed unreal, and Ethan had hired her primarily because his previous housekeeper had retired and his penthouse had descended into a specific kind of wealthy disorder. Expensive things left in wrong places, suits piling up for dry cleaning, a refrigerator full of things that had once been food. Maria was efficient, thorough, and so careful about staying out of his way that most mornings, Ethan barely registered that another human being was sharing his 14,000-square-foot home. He knew her name. He knew she had a daughter, because the agency had mentioned it in passing, and because once, early on, he had come home unexpectedly and heard the soft sound of a child's laughter from the guest suite at the far end of the East Wing, the suite he had told Maria she could use, along with the adjoining room, since the commute from her previous apartment had been adding 2 hours to her already long days. He had paused in the hallway at the sound, feeling something he couldn't quite name, something that pulled at an old thread in his chest. Then his phone had rung, and the moment had dissolved, and he had gone back to his life. That had been 3 months ago. Since then, he had not thought about Maria or her daughter any more than a man thinks about the furniture in a room he passes through every day without stopping. Not because he was cruel. Ethan was not, at his core, a cruel man, but because he had trained himself so thoroughly in the art of not needing things that he had accidentally also trained himself in the art of not seeing them. It was the second Thursday of November, when everything changed. The board meeting had run 6 hours over schedule. A deal in Sao Paulo had collapsed, taking with it 3 months of negotiations and a partnership he had genuinely believed in. By the time his driver pulled up to the building, it was 11:58, almost midnight, and Ethan felt the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the weight of being a certain kind of person for too many consecutive years. He rode the elevator up in silence, loosening his tie, staring at his own reflection in the polished doors and not entirely recognizing the man who stared back. He did not expect to hear anything when he stepped inside. The penthouse was always quiet at this hour. Maria would have finished her work hours ago. Her daughter would be asleep. But the moment the elevator doors slid open into the foyer, Ethan Caldwell heard something that stopped him where he stood. The sound of a woman crying, soft and steady, the kind of crying that has been going on for a long time, and underneath it, high and trembling, the sound of a very small child doing the same. For a moment, Ethan simply stood in the foyer with his briefcase still in his hand, his coat still on, listening to sounds he had not been prepared for. The penthouse, always so controlled, so carefully maintained in its expensive silence, felt suddenly like a completely different place. Those sounds, so human and unguarded and raw, seemed almost impossible here, like birdsong inside a bank vault. He set his briefcase down slowly. He put his keys on the console table without the usual decisive click. And then, moving more carefully than he had moved in years, he walked toward the east wing. He found them in the small sitting room adjacent to the guest suite. Maria, 28 years old, sitting on the floor with her back against the sofa and her knees pulled up to her chest. She was dressed in a faded blue sweater and dark leggings, her long dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face buried in her hands. Beside her, pressed so tightly against her side that there seemed to be no space between them at all, was her daughter. The little girl was 3 years old. Her name, Ethan would later learn, was Rosie. Right now, Rosie had her small face pressed into her mother's arm, her tiny fists clutching the fabric of Maria's sweater with the grip of someone who has learned that the only safe thing in the world is this one person, right here. She was crying in the breathless, exhausted way that very small children cry after they have been frightened for a long time, not in big dramatic sobs, but in hitching, trembling sighs, as though even the act of crying had worn her out. Neither of them had heard him come in. The room was lit only by the small lamp on the side table, casting everything in warm amber, and the city glittered 62 floors below the window like a scattered galaxy. It was, despite everything, a beautiful scene, and the beauty of it, combined with the obvious pain at its center, did something to Ethan's chest that he was wholly unprepared for. He stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds before Maria looked up. The expression on her face, when she saw him, was something he would not forget for the rest of his life. It was a face that went through several things at once: shock, embarrassment, the instinctive straightening of someone who has been caught being human in front of a person who holds authority over their life. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes went very wide. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, hoarse from crying, she said, "Mr. Caldwell, I'm so sorry. I thought you would be. I'm so sorry." She was already starting to move, already pulling herself to her feet, already reaching for Rosie as though she needed to gather her daughter and disappear before she caused any more disruption. And something about that, the speed of her apology, the automatic guilt in it, the way she moved like someone who has learned to make herself small at a moment's notice, cut through the last of Ethan's professional armor and reached something that had been dormant inside him for a very long time. "Stop," he said. His voice came out gentler than he intended. "Please don't get up." Maria froze. Rosie clutched against her chest. The little girl's face now turned toward this new person in the doorway with wide, tear-wet eyes. She was a beautiful child, dark curls, her mother's brown eyes, a small, serious face that was still trying to decide whether to be afraid. Ethan crouched down. It was an instinctive movement, the kind you make when you are trying to seem less threatening to someone who is frightened. He was not entirely sure he had ever crouched down in his own home before. The imported marble floor was cold through his suit trousers. He didn't care. "What happened?" he asked. Maria opened her mouth, closed it. The story that came out next was halting and ashamed, delivered in pieces, with long pauses during which she wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and steadied her breathing, and looked somewhere past his shoulder instead of at his face. It was the story of a phone call she had received that evening, while Ethan was still at his board meeting, while Rosie was eating her small dinner of pasta and cut-up fruit at the kitchen table. Her brother in Guatemala, her only remaining family, the person who had wired her money when she first came to America, the person she sent money back to every month from her salary, had been hospitalized. The doctors believed it was serious. She needed to get there. She had been on her phone for 2 hours trying to find flights, trying to call the hospital for information, trying not to cry in front of Rosie, failing at that last part, and then failing even more completely once Rosie had started crying too, not because the toddler understood what was happening, but because Rosie was 3 years old and could read her mother's face like a book. And her mother's face had been saying something was terribly wrong. By the time Maria finished speaking, the room was very quiet. Rosie had stopped crying. She was watching Ethan with the solemn, unblinking attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. Ethan sat down on the floor. Not on the sofa. Not in the chair. On the floor, across from Maria, his expensive suit jacket pooling around him, his loosened tie slightly askew. He sat down like a man who had run out of ways to be the person he usually performed and found himself, unexpectedly, simply being someone else. "Tell me about your brother," he said. Section 3. A man sits on his own floor. Maria Santos had worked for many wealthy people. Before Ethan Caldwell, there had been a hedge fund manager in Lincoln Park who had never once asked her name, a retired surgeon in Streeterville who had been kind but distant in the specific way of people who are used to having staff, and a tech executive in River North who had treated the household as a system to be optimized rather than a home to be lived in. She had learned, over 8 years of this work, exactly what to expect from men like these. She had learned to be efficient and invisible and grateful, to never make her personal life anyone else's problem, to iron the shirts and polish the surfaces and disappear. She had not been prepared for Ethan Caldwell to sit down on the floor. She had not been prepared for him to ask about her brother and then actually listen to the answer. His name was Miguel. He was 25, the youngest of the 3 Santos siblings, the one who had inherited their father's laugh and their mother's stubbornness in equal measure. Maria had helped raise him after their parents died. She had been 17 to his 9, the age gap between them filled with a specific tenderness that comes from necessity. She had worked through her own grief because there had been a little boy who needed meals and homework help and someone to make sure he did not fall apart. She had come to America for him, eventually, for the money she could send back, for the life she was trying to build toward a future where he didn't have to worry. As she talked, haltingly at first, and then with more steadiness, she watched the man across from her. He was not doing the things she expected. The polite nodding, the faint impatience masked as sympathy, the reaching for a checkbook or a business card as the fastest solution. He was listening in the way that very few people listen, with his full attention, his eyes on her face, his body still. He asked questions. He remembered details she had mentioned earlier and circled back to them. He treated her brother like a real person rather than a problem to be managed. Rosie, who had been pressed against Maria's side this whole time with the vigilance of a child on guard, had gradually, almost imperceptibly, relaxed. She was watching Ethan with open curiosity now. Toddlers have their own way of assessing people, not through credentials or social cues, but through some instinct that is still uncluttered by learned politeness. Rosie was assessing him. He had not looked away from her mother to look at his phone. He had not stood up. He had not talked loudly or done anything sudden or frightening. He was just there on the floor, being present in a way that apparently met whatever 3-year-old criteria Rosie was applying. At some point, Rosie climbed off the sofa entirely and sat down on the rug. At some point after that, she picked up the small stuffed rabbit. She went everywhere with a threadbare brown thing named, simply, Bun. and held it out toward Ethan with the gravity of someone making a significant offering. Ethan looked at Bun. He looked at Rosie. Something moved across his face that Maria could not quite read. "Thank you," he said, very seriously, and took the rabbit gently with both hands and held it for a moment before handing it back. Rosie accepted this exchange with the satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been confirmed, and then she crawled across the rug and sat down next to him. Maria's breath caught. She had seen Rosie do this before. This particular act of toddler trust, this decision to simply install herself beside a person she had decided was safe. She had seen Rosie do it with Maria's former neighbor, Mrs. Chun, and with the kind school librarian at the literacy program, and with one other person in 3 years of life. The fact that she was doing it now, with this man she had never met, in the middle of a night that had been full of fear, something about it made Maria's throat go tight in a completely different way than it had been tight an hour ago. Ethan was still looking at Rosie, with that expression Maria couldn't name. He was not smiling exactly, but his face had gone very soft, softer than any face she had seen him wear in 4 months of living in his home. He looked younger. He looked, she realized, like someone who had not been sat next to in a very long time and did not quite know what to do with it. "I want to help," he said. He said it simply, without the performance of generosity that she had learned to recognize in wealthy people, the way they sometimes announce charity like a press release. He said it the way someone says a thing when they mean it and nothing else. "With the flight, with the hospital, with whatever your brother needs. I have contacts in Guatemala City. I can make calls tonight." Maria opened her mouth to say what she always said, that she couldn't accept that it was too much, that she would manage. The words formed in her throat and then stopped there, blocked by something she couldn't quite name, and when she looked at him, sitting cross-legged on his own marble floor with his expensive suit slightly rumpled and a toddler pressed against his arm, she found that she could not say them. "Why?" she asked instead. The question came out before she could stop it, quiet and unguarded and more honest than she had intended. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Rosie had rested her head against his arm. He looked down at her, and the look on his face was the look of someone who has just been given something they didn't know they were missing, and is not yet of words for the feeling. "Because," he said slowly, "I've been living in this apartment for 3 years, and tonight is the first time it has sounded like a home." Section 4. What money cannot buy, and what it can. By 1 in the morning, Ethan had made 5 phone calls. The first was to his travel coordinator, a woman named Sandra, who had been woken from sleep and did not complain because she knew Ethan Caldwell was not someone who called at 1 in the morning about things that could wait. Within 20 minutes, she had secured 2 seats on the earliest morning flight to Guatemala City, a 6:45 departure from O'Hare, and a return ticket for Maria that was open-ended because Ethan had said, quietly and firmly, that she should stay as long as she needed and not worry about the return. The second call was to a colleague who knew someone on the board of Hospital General San Juan de Dios, one of the largest hospitals in Guatemala City. Within an hour, there was a contact there, a Dr. Herrera, who had been given Miguel's information and had agreed to personally ensure that the young man received the best available care and to keep Maria informed. The third call was to his accountant, to arrange an immediate wire transfer to cover whatever expenses the hospital required that insurance did not. The fourth was to his driver, to be ready at 4:30 to take Maria and Rosie to the airport. The fifth, he made standing in the kitchen while Maria put Rosie down in the guest room, a call to a 24-hour grocery delivery service, because at some point during their conversation Maria had mentioned that she hadn't eaten since lunch, because she had spent the evening too frightened to think about food, and Ethan Caldwell had decided, quietly and without announcing it, that this was unacceptable. When Maria came back from putting Rosie down, the child had fallen asleep almost immediately, worn out from crying and the strange emotional weather of the evening. She found Ethan in the kitchen. His jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled up. He was making tea with the focused expression of a man who is not accustomed to making tea and is treating it as a project that requires his full competence. He had also, somehow, found the box of crackers and the good cheese she kept in the far left corner of the refrigerator for Rosie's snacks, and arranged them on a small plate on the kitchen island with the solemn precision of someone who has never plated food before but is determined to do it right. Maria stopped in the kitchen doorway. For a moment, she could not speak. In 4 months, she had cooked in this kitchen and cleaned this kitchen and navigated around it in the specific, careful way of someone who works in a space that doesn't belong to her. She had always felt the kitchen's magnificence as something slightly opposed to her. The gleaming professional-grade appliances, the counters of honed Italian marble, the glass-fronted cabinets full of dishes that probably cost more than her monthly rent had before she moved in. It had always felt like a kitchen for looking at, not a kitchen for being human in. Ethan, standing in it now with rolled-up sleeves and an expression of mild domestic uncertainty, holding a mug of imperfectly steeped tea, made it feel, for the first time, like somewhere people actually lived. "I don't know how strong you take it," he said, nodding at the tea with slight embarrassment. "I probably steeped it too long. I don't usually make tea." "That's all right," she said softly. She sat down at the kitchen island. He sat across from her. They ate crackers and cheese at 1 in the morning while the city sparkled distantly below, and Maria told him more about Miguel. The real Miguel, not just the medical emergency. The boy who had wanted to be a doctor since he was 7 and had read every textbook he could get his hands on, who had a gift for mathematics that had earned him a scholarship to the university in Guatemala City, who called Maria every Sunday morning without fail and always started the call the same way, with "Buenas. Jimena, how's my American big sister?" She told him about Rosie, about how Rosie had come into their life 3 years ago as the most unexpected and transformative thing that had ever happened to Maria, how she had spent the first 6 months terrified she was doing everything wrong and had somehow found her way through to a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. And Ethan listened. He listened the way he had listened in the sitting room, completely, without distraction, without the half-presence that Maria had come to associate with people who are physically there, but mentally already somewhere else. He asked about Rosie's father, gently, with an easy out built into the question, and Maria told him, briefly and without bitterness, that he was not in the picture, had never really been, and that she had long since made her peace with that. He asked what Rosie's favorite thing was, and the answer made him smile for the first time all evening. She loved puddles, specifically the larger and muddier the better, and considered them essentially the highest form of fun available to a person of any age. "She sounds like someone who has the right idea about things," Ethan said. "She usually does," Maria agreed. At some point, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, the conversation shifted. Maria found herself asking about him, not about business, not about the apartment, but about him. What had happened with the meeting today, the one that had clearly gone wrong, that he had arrived home wearing on his face. And Ethan, who never talked about himself with the people who worked for him, who had maintained the careful architecture of professional distance for 3 years in this apartment, found himself, to his own surprise, answering. He talked about the deal that had collapsed, about the weight of always being the person who makes the decisions, about his father, briefly, in the oblique way of someone who has been carrying something for so long that they have almost stopped noticing its weight, but not quite, about the way the apartment felt at the end of these days, all the square footage and all the views and all the beautiful expensive things, and still the specific hollow sound of a space that is not quite a home. Maria listened. She was very good at listening, it turned out. She had the same quality he had, the gift of full attention, of making the person across from her feel that what they were saying was the only thing in the room. At 2:15, she said she should try to sleep for a few hours before the airport. She said it quietly and without the rush of apology that had characterized her speech earlier in the evening. She said it as one person speaks to another. Before she stood up, she looked at him across the kitchen island and said, "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I don't have the right words for this. Ethan, he said. Please. She looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time in a small and genuine way, she smiled. Thank you, Ethan. Section 5. The week he learned to wait. She was gone for 11 days. Ethan had not anticipated how different the apartment would feel in her absence, and the depth of that difference alarmed him in ways he spent several evenings walking around his 62 floors of glass and city light trying to understand. He had been alone in this apartment for years. He had been comfortable alone. He was not a man who needed company. He had repeated these facts to himself with such regularity that he had stopped questioning their truth. He questioned them now. The first morning, he walked into the kitchen at 6:30 and found it exactly as he always found it, pristine, organized, silent, and stood in the middle of it for a full minute doing nothing. He made coffee badly and drank it at the counter looking out at a Lake Michigan sky the color of pewter, and the silence was not the comfortable silence it had always been. It was the silence of a room that as recently had sound in it and misses the sound. He thought about crackers and imperfect tea. He thought about a small child who sat next to strangers she had decided to trust. He texted Maria that first afternoon, a brief, professional message asking if she had arrived safely, if the hospital had reached out, if there was anything she needed. She replied within an hour. Yes, they had arrived. Dr. Herrera had been at the hospital when they got there. Miguel was stable. The diagnosis was serious, a cardiac issue that had apparently been building for months, ignored because Miguel had been too busy and too young to imagine it was anything real, but it was treatable. She was with him. Rosie was charming the nurses. Everything was, for now, okay. He read the message 3 times. He replied, Good. Tell Miguel he has a good sister. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, I will. He says he can't wait to meet the man who sent his sister to him on a private charter at 6 a.m. Ethan felt something in his chest that it took him a moment to identify as something close to happiness. He was not sure he had felt it in quite this form before, uncomplicated, immediate, unconnected to any deal or achievement or external measure of success. Just the simple warmth of having done something for someone and having it matter. He called his housekeeper agency and told them he did not need a temporary replacement. He did not fully understand why until he was already hanging up, and then he understood it very clearly. He did not want someone else in this apartment. He wanted it to wait. Over the following days, he found himself doing small things that would not have been like him a week ago. He went to the grocery store himself, an experience that was quietly humbling, since he had not done it in approximately 4 years and had forgotten that it required knowledge he no longer possessed, such as which aisle cereal lived in, or whether the milk was near the front or the back, and came home with more things than he needed, including a bag of the crackers he now knew Rosie liked, placed carefully in the far left corner of the refrigerator where they belonged. He straightened things that didn't need straightening. He watered the plants on the balcony, which Maria had apparently been tending and which he had not even noticed existed. He and Maria texted every day. The messages were brief at first, updates on Miguel, short questions, shorter answers. But they lengthened, gradually, in the natural way that conversations do when the two people having them find that they have more to say than they anticipated. She told him about her day at the hospital, about the Guatemalan nurses who had become Rosie's devoted admirers, about Miguel's frustration with being told to rest, about the particular quality of the afternoon light in Guatemala City that fell through the hospital windows and made everything look like a painting from a different century. He told her about the Sao Paulo deal, not the collapse, but the possibility he was beginning to see in its ruins, a restructured version that might actually be stronger. He told her about a dinner he'd attended where he had found himself thinking, in the middle of a speech about third-quarter projections, about a 3-year-old girl and her rabbit. He did not say the last part. He said it to himself, in the privacy of his apartment, and was surprised by how clearly he could see it. The image of Rosie handing him bun, with that solemn look of significant offering. On the 7th day, he asked, trying to be casual about it, whether Rosie was doing all right with all the change. The response came back with a small sound clip attached. Maria had not said anything, just recorded 30 seconds of Rosie's voice describing, with total narrative confidence, the excellent puddle she had found in the hospital courtyard that morning, and how deep it was, and how much she had jumped in it, and how the nurses had laughed. Rosie's voice was small and bright, and certain in the way of children who have not yet learned to be uncertain about joy. Ethan sat in his quiet penthouse and listened to the clip 4 times. On the 10th day, Maria told him that Miguel was recovering well enough that the doctors were confident he would be fully stable within the month. He would need surgery eventually, but it was scheduled and manageable. She was thinking of coming home if that was all right. He replied immediately, "Of course. Come whenever you're ready. Take more time if you need it." Then he stared at what he had written for a long moment. Come home, he had written. Not come back. Not return when convenient. Home. He left it as he had written it. That night, standing at his window with the city spread out below him, he thought about the word and what it meant and why it had come to him so naturally, and whether it had always been true, or whether it had become true sometime in the last 11 days, or whether. And this was the thought that stayed with him, quiet and clear, as the city lights reflected off the lake. It had become true sometime in the first 11 seconds of a midnight when he had walked into his apartment and heard it. Sound for the first time, like somewhere a life actually happened. Maria and Rosie came home on a Tuesday. Ethan had not told Maria he would be there. He had a board meeting that afternoon which he rescheduled without telling anyone why, a thing he had never done before in his professional life, and which Sandra, his coordinator, had marked in her mental notes as significant without quite knowing what it signified. He was in the apartment when the elevator opened, sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, because he had stopped paying attention to the coffee at some point and started paying attention to the sound of the elevator. Rosie came through the door first, the way 3-year-olds do, all at once, with total commitment. She was wearing a yellow rain jacket and carrying bun, and she looked around the apartment with the expression of a person returning from a long journey and conducting an inventory of what remained. Then she located Ethan at the kitchen island, and her face broke into a smile of such uncomplicated delight that Ethan felt the smile hit him somewhere behind the sternum. "You're here," Rosie announced, as though this were both a fact and an achievement. She crossed the room to him with a purposeful trot of someone who has somewhere specific to be, and before he had quite understood what was happening, she held up Bun. She had brought him back. Not to show him, not to offer for a moment. She set Bun down on the kitchen island beside his laptop with the air of someone returning borrowed goods, then looked up at him with her mother's eyes and said, "Bun missed you." Ethan looked at Bun. He looked at Rosie. His throat had done something complicated. "I miss Bun too," he said very seriously. Rosie accepted this with satisfaction and then immediately asked if there were crackers, because she was hungry from the airplane. Maria appeared in the doorway while Ethan was opening the cabinet where he had, with forethought he was not going to mention unless asked, restocked Rosie's crackers. She looked at him in the kitchen, at the open cabinet, at her daughter sitting on the counter stool, at the whole unremarkable domesticity of the scene, and the expression that crossed her face was something he had not seen before. It was not surprise, exactly. It was the look of someone who has been hoping for something and is now trying to decide whether they are actually seeing it. "You're home," she said. It came out softer than she intended. "I rescheduled," he said, which was not an explanation but which they both seemed to understand. The weeks that followed did not change in one dramatic moment. They changed in the way that real things change, in accumulations of small moments, in habits that developed without being decided upon, in routines that grew around the three of them as naturally as vines around a structure that happens to be standing in the right place. Ethan started coming home at 7 instead of 9. Not because he had to, but because 7 was when Rosie had dinner, and dinner had become the hour he looked forward to most in his day. He did not announce this shift. He simply made it. Maria started talking to him differently, not as an employee talks to an employer, but as a person talks to another person who has been at the same table long enough to be considered, in some wordless way, present. She disagreed with him sometimes. She had opinions about the Sao Paulo restructuring that turned out to be incisive in a way he had not expected, and that he incorporated without crediting to her in the room, but told her about afterward, over the kitchen counter, in a conversation that went on longer than either of them had planned. Rosie inserted herself into his life with the implacable confidence of someone who has found something good and sees no reason to be restrained about it. She brought him drawings. She demanded he witness her puddle assessments from the balcony whenever it rained. She narrated her dreams to him at breakfast with the thoroughness of someone filing a report. She called him Ethan with perfect seriousness and never Mr. Caldwell, because when Maria had asked her to say Mr. Caldwell, Rosie had looked at her mother and then at Ethan and then back at her mother with an expression that said she found the suggestion impractical, and somehow the matter had been closed. On a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after they had returned, Ethan took them to Millennium Park to see the ice skaters because Rosie had asked 47 times, and he had said they would go when it was the right weekend, and had then run out of reasons why this weekend was the wrong one. They stood at the edge of the rink wrapped in coats and scarves, Rosie on Ethan's shoulders because she could see better from there, her small mittened hands braced on the top of his head with the casual authority of someone who has determined this is simply where she lives now. Below them on the ice, a couple was skating hand in hand. The city was cold and bright and loud with holiday music and the sound of blades and the particular joy of people choosing to be cold together because the cold is more bearable that way. Maria was standing beside him. Their shoulders were almost touching. It was, Ethan would think later, possibly the most ordinary moment of his life. And it was, he would think later, the best moment he could remember. "I owe you an apology," he said. Maria looked at him. "For what?" "For 4 months of living in the same space and not seeing you." He said it simply, without the performance of self-flagellation, because he was not interested in turning his own growth into a spectacle. He just wanted her to know. "You were right in front of me, and I had gotten very good at not noticing things." Maria was quiet for a moment. On his shoulders, Rosie had spotted someone on the ice with a very large scarf and was describing this scarf in meticulous detail to no one in particular. "You noticed," Maria said, "when it mattered. That's the thing about people. It's not who they are when everything is easy. It's who they are at midnight when something is hard." Ethan looked at her. He thought about a briefcase set down in a foyer. A floor made of imported marble, and the decision to sit on it anyway. Tea steeped too long. Crackers placed in the left corner of a refrigerator where they belonged. A text that said "come home." A small girl returning a stuffed rabbit as though it had been held in trust. He thought about the long, particular ache of living inside a life that has all the right surfaces and none of the right warmth, and then the night it had cracked open, and what had come through the crack. "I'd like to keep noticing," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal. It was what it was. A man at the edge of an ice rink on a December evening, a child on his shoulders describing a stranger's scarf, a woman beside him who had walked into his home 4 months ago and, without either of them knowing it, begun to change the shape of what home meant. Maria looked at the ice. She was smiling. It was the quiet, real kind of smile that doesn't know it's being watched and doesn't need to. "Then keep noticing," she said. Rosie, still narrating the scarf from her place at altitude, reached down and grabbed both of their hands, one mittened hand in each of theirs, Not because she needed studying, but because she had decided they were all connected and that this was simply the proper arrangement of things. She was 3 years old. She understood some things better than most. Below them, the skaters went around and around in their patient circles, and the lights of the city came on one by one as the December evening deepened into night, and on the 60th second floor man who had once had everything discovered, at last, what everything actually meant. His name was Ethan. He was 33. He had arrived home at midnight, and everything had changed. And in the morning, there would be puddles to assess.